Is thy face like thy mother's, my fair child? Ada, sole daughter of my house and heart. When last I saw thy young blue eyes, they smiled, and then we parted. Not as now we part, but with a hope. Awaking with a start, the waters heave around me, and on high the winds lift up their voices. I depart, whither I know not, but the hours gone by when Albion's lessening shores could grieve o'er glad mine eye.
At the time he wrote Canto the Third of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Byron was separated from his daughter, forced overseas by a medley of scandals, bereft of political hope. The Byron scholar Jerome McGann writes that at this point of the poem, Byron is, quote, plunged in a kind of death in life in which he can find neither love nor hope nor meaning. But his immediate desire for forgetfulness is allied to his more fundamental need to recover a sense of his own vitality. Byron turns to poetry as an activity that might satisfy his wishes for forgetfulness and revitalization. This is one of the most famous romantic commentaries on the artistic process.
'Tis to create, and in creating live, a being more intense, that we endow with form our fancy, gaining as we give the life we imagine, even as I do now. What am I? Nothing. But not so art thou, soul of my thought, with whom I traverse earth, invisible, but gazing, as I glow, mixed with thy spirit, blended with thy birth, and feeling still with thee in my crushed feelings' dearth.
He has gained intensity by giving out or pouring forth poetry. Byron has imagined himself as the fictitious Harold and projected this persona onto the world. This is what it means to endow form, which exists already, with fancy, which is imaginary. To be a poet is to live intensely. There is a self-perpetuating energy in gaining as we give. Intensity gives rise to and results from creativity. Ironically, the act of character creation reveals Byron's true self because he witnesses the power of imagination in process, in the act of creation, or poiesis. He needs Harold here, not to disguise himself, but to recover the vitality or intensity he felt when composing the earlier parts of the poem, when he first invented the character. He will gain similar power from imaginative union with Napoleon. Byron attempts to create himself anew through the act of writing poetry. Sadly, the words on the page can only signify that process to us. To experience it, we must become poets ourselves.
Yet must I think less wildly. I have thought too long and darkly till my brain became in its own eddy boiling and o'erwrought, a whirling gulf of fantasy and flame. And thus, untaught in youth my heart to tame, my springs of life were poisoned. 'Tis too late. Yet am I changed, though still enough the same in strength to bear what time cannot abate, and feed on bitter fruits without accusing fate.
Even though the emotions that arise are predominantly negative, they are welcome because of their intensity. Anything is better than monotony. Anything is better than the numbness Byron felt at the start of the canto. Being is becoming. Life is change, the possibility to transform into something else, even though the stimulus is painful, with the requirement that one can feed on bitter fruits without accusing fate. He feels his power stirring. To go further, he wants to relinquish the past by retrieving Harold. Harold is stopped in his tracks by the sudden apprehension that his sorrowful thoughts correspond to collective needs for renewal and forgetfulness in the landscape before him. "Stop, for thy tread is on an empire's dust," Byron exclaims. He is conscious that a defining moment in European history has just occurred. The futility of conflict is expressed as an absence. Byron wonders, is the spot marked with no colossal bust? The strongest indication of a battle that only took place a year ago, as far as he can see, is that, quote, red rain hath made the harvest grow. The fertility is indebted to strife, paralleling Byron's musings on creativity. Byron achieves self-knowledge in an extended reflection on Napoleon's personality. Obviously, with an eye on his own qualities, he excuses the general's restlessness in light of his achievements. He admires virtues and accepts shortcomings in Napoleon that are also his own.
But quiet to quick bosoms is a hell, and there hath been thy bane. There is a fire and motion of the soul which will not dwell in its own narrow being, but aspire beyond the fitting medium of desire. And but once kindled, quenchless evermore, preys upon high adventure, nor can tire of aught but rest. A fever at the core, fatal to him who bears, to all who ever bore.
The motion of the soul that impels Napoleon is a line that brings us back to the early stanza on creation, soul of my thought, with whom I traverse earth. Byron describes poetry as comparable to conquest. Similarity to Napoleon ennobles Byron, but it doesn't appease his melancholy, and he looks for sources of consolation as he tours the Rhine Valley. He considers whether nature can offer him some restoration. But unlike something we would find in Wordsworth, nature offers nothing to Byron, because in nature he keeps seeing evidence of human brutality amongst the natural beauties. A shattered wall is evidence of war, and he comes across a small pyramid over the ashes of heroes. The journey onward into what is modern Switzerland takes us to a place associated with the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. As with the earlier portrayal of Napoleon, phrases in the account of Rousseau echo what Byron has said of himself. Wild Rousseau recalls Byron's self-admonishment that he must think less wildly. The Genevan philosopher, who from woe wrung overwhelming eloquence, is a model for Byron's project to take imaginative stimulus from despair and make poetry. All of this describes the Byronic hero more closely than it does Rousseau. Think of the phrase self-torturing, which sounds rather like what he said of Napoleon, which sounds rather like what he said of himself. Through his contemplation of such historical figures, the Byronic hero has gained self-knowledge.